Morning, kids. How are you doing? Hope everybody's okay. Yes, this is virtual wood shop. I understand things are difficult, but we'll get through it. What I want to talk to you today about is a little bit in terms of cutting dados on your short table. Now, I realize that everybody isn't making a short table, but there's so many of you who are at the point where you've cleaned up your legs, you've cleaned up your shelves, you've finished them, whether you stained them, polyurethaned them, but they're completely done, ready to go. Now all we need to do is to cut the joints in the legs, which of course everybody knows is going to be the dado joint. That dado joint was very similar to the footstools, the sides that you guys made for the footstools. To relate this to something else, if you're making a sign and you're routing the sign, if you're making a frame around that sign, chances are you're going to cut a groove, not a dado because the dado goes against the grain, but you're going to be cutting a groove along the grain that will frame out the inside of that sign. So you're going to be basically doing the same thing. And what I want to show you today is just setting up a dado and cutting out the dado the best way we possibly can on the table saw. And it's going to be a little bit different. When I was cutting out the footstool sides, what I did was I made 3 outline cuts. You took a hand chisel, you chiseled them down. Well, what's different is that we're just going to use the machine to work on what we need it to be. So what I have cut right now are my 4 legs. What I decided to do with my 4 legs was not to bullnose them. All I wanted to do was to break the edge of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the best surface that I want to see on the outside of the leg. If you remember, if you look at the leg, you have a good side, you also have a bad side. The bad side's the inside. You could have 2 good sides, but if you're looking at the best side, the side that we want to see, I'll ask you to put a piece of tape on the outside of that leg to make sure that that is going to face up when you're cutting the dado. To cut the dado, what we're going to do is we're going to take a walk over to the table saw, and there's a pivotal question here. What little tool do you use on the table saw to accurately cut dados? And the answer to that, and this is how I know that you're paying attention, is going to be the miter gauge. The miter gauge is what we're going to use to make sure that our legs are stabilized and that they're not just cut by freehand. If you do that, chances are you're going to eat this board. So when you do this and you cross-cut your pieces, you are going to use the miter gauge, and that'll be the secret answer to your question here. To do this, I'm going to make several adjustments. The first thing I decided to do was to have my best side surface up, or if you guys do it, you'll do it with a piece of tape. What I want to do is decide where I want those dados or where I want those shelves to lay. On this particular project, if you look at this, there's a difference. The distance from the top of this leg to where this shelf starts is 4 inches. From here, from the bottom of the leg to where the shelf begins is only 3 inches. You can decide to make them different. However, you're going to have 2 separate settings of the fence when you're making your cut. If you have them the same size, it's actually easier, and that's what I'm going to choose to do. I'm going to have my setting to be 3 inches down from the top and 3 inches up from the bottom as to where my shelves are going to start. To do that, as I said, my top side is facing up. I have that all ready to go. What I need to do is I need to set the height of the blade to be half the thickness of the wood. So what I did was I took my wood, and what I did was I drew a line a little bit less than half the thickness of the wood. So if you want to take a look at this, you can see that this is just a little bit less than half. We don't want to make that dado too deep because remember, we have to bore a hole in there and we're going to put a screw in there to attach this leg to those shelves. To do this, I'm going to go back to the table saw and I'm going to raise the blade to that height right there. To do it, as on any table saw, the blade height adjustment you should know is located on the front of the saw if I'm standing directly at the saw's face. So if you look at this, the blade height adjustment is over here. Of course, on the left-hand side, that other crank wheel is the angle. That will angle the blade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the crank wheel, and which direction do I turn it to move it up? Always clockwise, and that's exactly what I'll do.
So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna crank the crank wheel clockwise until it gets to about the height of my line. Once it reaches about the height of the line, then what I can do is I can take the silver knob that's in the center of that crank wheel and just tighten that down, and that'll prevent the blade from moving up and down with just vibration. The next thing that I want to do is I want to set the fence to the width or the distance down from the top that I want my shelves to go. So I said to you guys, I was going to cut it 3 inches up and 3 inches down. To do that, loosen up the fence. I'm going to slide it over so that the sight glass hits 3 inches. So if I look at this, right there I'm accurate at exactly 3 inches. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the crank wheel and I'm going to tighten that down. So now the fence is set and it's locked in place. The blade height is set. It's a little bit less than the height of that line. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a series of cuts. Understanding that I'm using a single blade. We had a lesson before where you used the dado. But the problem with the dado and hardwoods is that if I cut the dado head and make a swatch in this leg that's 3/4 of an inch wide, a lot of times it will chip on the backside because you're taking off so much material. So what I want to do is I just want to take a little bit off at a time. I have to be patient. So when I do this, I'm going to take the saw and I'm going to make a series of cuts. That right there, the thickness of that blade is about 1/8 of an inch. So if that's 1/8 of an inch, I'm going to have to make 6 cuts in order to cut a dado that's 3/4 of an inch wide. That's 1/8 of an inch for each cut that I make. As opposed to setting up the dado head where I can make it in one cut, but the problem is we lose the quality with the wood chipping out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that saw blade, I'm going to pass it through, and I'm going to check to see if it fits into my shelf. Chances are it's not because the thickness that I'm going to cut is only 1/8 of an inch. So what I want to do, of course, is use good safety practices. I'm rolling up my sleeves. I have my safety glasses on. I'm all set, ready to go. I'm now going to take my board with my leg face up, my good side face up. I'm going to place it up against the fence. If you take a look, it's right up against the fence and I'll never move from that fence adjustment. I never want to move it off. I always want to keep it up against the fence. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 4 fingers of my left hand. As everybody knows, everybody on this saw is a righty. So I'm going to take these 4 fingers. I'm going to put them holding my board up against the miter gauge, and my left thumb is on the back side, which will lock that in. The other thing, sometimes on these legs, there might be a little cup to the board. So I always like to take my left index finger and keep that so it's putting pressure close to the blade. So as I hold up the miter gauge, I'm locking my board in at this position, and my right hand is actually going to push the miter gauge through. So my right hand is on the silver knob. As I push it through, I'm just going to simply push it through, push it back. And then, because my setting is the same for my top side of my leg as it is for the bottom side, I could simply take this, flip it over, and make the cut from this side. When I do this, I'm going to do that to all 4 legs. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the fence out 1/8 of an inch and continue to make my cuts for my dado. So I'm going to start this right now. Any questions? Here we go. Oops. My left hand is holding the stock up against the fence, holding it down and up against the miter gauge. My right hand is on the silver knob. So all I'm going to do is make a cut, and I'm going to come back. I'll take the board, and I'm going to flip it around so I cut it for my other side dado, whether it's the top dado or the bottom dado. The biggest mistake you could possibly make is this. I make this cut, and then I flip it over this way because I'm going to have opposite dado. I always want to make sure that good side is facing up, and I'm going to make the cut. Well, if you look over here, I've created an 1/8" dado and an 1/8" dado. Here's where my shelf starts. Here's where my shelf starts here. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do that for every single one of these legs. So I'll do it for the other 3 legs as well. Good side facing up. Left hand, I'm going to make the cut. Flip it. Make the cut. Move on to my next leg. Good side facing up. Cut it. And cut it. And the last leg, same exact way. The most important thing, and you can see it here, if you look, there's a gap between the table and the board. That's where my index finger really comes into play, where I push it down. If I left it up, the dado wouldn't be the same depth. So I have now cut dados in all 4 of these legs. So if you look at this, this is 1/8 of an inch. Now the question is my shelf going to fit into this dado? I'm going to try it. Well, I did do my push-ups today. Nope, it's not going to fit. What do I have to? I have to make this wider, of course. And I'm going to make this cut large enough so that this shelf, which is pre-finished, everything is done on this shelf, is going to fit tightly into this dado. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move the fence out 1/8 of an inch. This is what I always preach to you guys. 0 to 12 on this particular fence, all of those measurements are broken down to 30 seconds of an inch. So if I look at this and I have to move it out 1/8 of an inch, it becomes an issue. If we were working from 12 to 54, all of them are 1/16 of an inch. That's what you guys were taught. So when you look at this particular setting, I'm going to tell you, and I've said this 100 times, I could see 3, I could see 4, I could see 3 1/2, I could see 3 1/4, I can see 3 3/4. 3 1/8 is smack there between 3 and 3 1/4. So I'm going to set the fence right there. And I can see that even though I'm blind. If you look, after I make that first cut, I'm going to move it out to 3 1/4. 3 3/8, smack there between 3 1/4 and 3 1/2. 3 1/2, and then I'm going to finally end up at 3 5/8. So someone says to me, hey, if this wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, how come you don't start at 3 and then end up at 3 3/4? The problem with that is I haven't allowed for the thickness of that blade, because right now that's only at 3 inches and I've made an 1/8 inch cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my consecutive cuts on this, and I'm going to see if I can get that shelf to fit in. Here we go. Move it out to 3 1/8, lock it in place, and I'm all set. The same exact thing that I did before, I want to remember, making sure that my board is up against the fence. So I make the cut. I've now created a 1/4 inch wide dado. Remember, I started out with an 1/8 inch wide dado. Hold it down tight. I make the cut. I make the cut. I make the cut. I make the cut. This isn't nearly as much fun without an audience. Here's my dado that's 1/4 of an inch. Of course, that shelf is not going to fit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to complete the rest of the cuts. I'm going to move it out now to 3 1/4. I'm at 3 1/8. And I'll continue to make my cut. You guys can watch me do that, making sure that I have the same safe practices I did with my first couple of cuts. The other thing that's worth noting is that I've had several students who've made these cuts and do them flawlessly, and then all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, do this, where they cut and then flipped it over, just because it's a matter of course. If you do that, not only are you embarrassed, but the teacher has to make a plug for you to make sure that that doesn't happen. In this case, they set the fence at the wrong setting. But if you have that situation, it doesn't look nearly as good. The good part about this is that this is going to be appearing on the inside of the leg, so we're not really going to notice that. But if it was on the outside of the leg, it would be a real problem. So when I'm making my cut as I do this, just make sure that you're always concentrating. I'm now setting it at 3 3/8, I'll make that cut. And I realize that this is repetitious, but it's hard to think of funny jokes without a good class. I'm now going to set it at 3 1/2. And I said to you guys, if it's 3/4 of an inch, I want to make sure that I stop and I don't go any farther than 3 5/8. And the reason for that is I want this to fit tight. So I'm going to try to be as accurate as I possibly can. Where is 3 5/8? Smack dab between 3 1/2 and 3 3/4. So at 3 5/8, I'm as good as I can see right there. I'm going to lock the fence in and make what I hope will be my last cut. So there's my cut. I'm just going to check to see if my piece fits in. And wouldn't you know, that fits in there absolutely perfect. This is how they do it in the movies. Everything always works out in the movies. If we had a regular class today, I'm sure I would have done something wrong. So I have now completed my 4 legs, complete with 2 dados on each side, 3 inches down from the top. What I wanted to mention to you, and I know that it's hard to understand this, but if I decided I wanted this one 5 inches down, or I'm sorry, 5 inches up from the bottom, what I would have to do is cut the 3-inch one first, or the 5-inch one first, and then reset it. It went quick for me because they were the same measurements. At 3 inches, I was able to cut and cut. So understand that. It might save you a little bit of time, but like I said at Burger King, in Denellen High School Woodshop, have it your way. If you wanted 5 inches up from the bottom and 3 inches down from the top, just like this student did, well, that's okay. It's just going to take a little bit of time, a little bit more time. The next thing that I'm ready to do here is I'm ready to cut the angle on my shelf to match this. So if I put this in here, right here, and this should fit in here nice and snug, which it does, when I cut this angle, it will be a seamless transition between the edge, the leg, and then the end, and that's what we're shooting for next. At this point, what we're going to do is move on to our second lesson, which will be about drilling holes. Tomorrow when you guys log on, you'll be able to see me set up the drill press, and I'll talk to you a little bit about chucks and drills and things like that. But the next thing we can do is we can mark out where the hole is going to go into this dado to attach a screw from the back side into the shelf. And it's a really simple thing to do. All I want to do is take a look at this dado. Where I am on the dado, I want to put a mark smack dab in the center. Many people say to me, should I measure this? Well, I trust that your eye is probably as accurate as any ruler that we have in the shop. So I'm just going to kind of do this by eye. Let's see, is that looks, no, that's not the center. Let me try this. This is perfect. No, that's not the center. That's the center. I'm going to take a guess that that's pretty accurate right there at the center. You're going to do the same thing for each one of these dados. I'm going to put a dot smack dab in the center, and when you do this, please do me a favor and make that nice and dark so that you can see it. Some people have made marks that have been so light that they mix up whether it's that little part of a knot or they're marked. So make sure your mark is nice and dark on each one of these dados. After you make the mark, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over to the drill press and we're going to drill holes. This lesson, when we talk about this, not only applies to people who are making dados for the legs. As I said to you, if you're going to cut a groove around a sign that's been routed, you want to make sure that we're going to do it the same exact way, raise the blade to a little bit less than half the thickness of the wood. But when you make your cuts, you're going to create, whether it's a dado or a groove, as accurately as you possibly can with these sorts of practices. If you guys have any questions, please do me a favor. You can send me something. I'll be more than happy to be online and answer your questions. If not, then I'll let you guys continue with your school day and move on to your next class, because I see that the bell is going to ring shortly. Stay in the classroom now. Stay in the bedroom now. Any questions? You guys have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.